In the struggling Rust Belt town of Pennsylvania, an 82-year-old man was about to change everything for a family in desperate need. What started as a routine grocery delivery took a shocking turn when they came face to face with generosity beyond imagination. Frank "Gunny" Morrison wasn't your typical food bank volunteer. For 30 years, he had served as a decorated Marine, known for his unwavering dedication to others. When he encountered the Roberts family living under a dangerously leaking roof, he had no idea they were walking into a mystery that would expose his most carefully guarded secret. Morrison's anonymous overnight roof replacement would lead to revelations that divided an entire community. What began as humble charity would become an earth-shattering discovery. Their neighbor was a billionaire defense contractor carrying unimaginable guilt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog clung to Millbrook's abandoned steel mill like a shroud over the dead. Frank Morrison stood at his kitchen window, watching the mist swirl through the broken windows of what had once been the town's heartbeat. 82 years on this earth, and he'd learned that some wounds never healed. They just got better at hiding. "Morning, Frank." Pastor David Williams looked up from sorting canned goods as Frank pushed through the community food bank's heavy door. The converted church basement smelled of cardboard and quiet desperation, a scent Frank had grown familiar with over the past 5 years of volunteering. "Morning, Pastor." Frank's voice carried the gravelly undertone of a man who'd shouted orders across too many battlefields. He hung his worn Marine Corps cap on a wooden peg and rolled up his sleeves, revealing the faded eagle, globe, and anchor tattoo that still drew respectful nods from younger veterans. Pastor Williams studied Frank with the practiced eye of someone who'd counseled broken souls for 3 decades. "You're early today. Everything all right?" Frank shrugged, already reaching for the clipboard that held the day's delivery routes. "Sleep's overrated at my age." That wasn't entirely true. Sleep brought dreams, and dreams brought Marcus. Better to stay busy, to keep his hands occupied with something useful. The dead didn't rest easy when the living carried their weight. "Got a new family on Maple Street," Pastor Williams said, handing Frank a box of groceries. "Sophia Roberts. Lost her husband 3 years back. 2 kids." He paused. "Pride runs deep in that one. Took 6 months to convince her to accept help." Frank nodded, understanding pride better than most. He'd spent decades learning how it could both build a man and destroy him. "I'll be gentle." The Roberts house sat like a wounded animal among its neighbors, a small craftsman with good bones, hidden beneath peeling paint and patched siding. Frank knocked softly, noting how the porch sagged and the front steps tilted at dangerous angles. Sophia Roberts opened the door with the cautious expression of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of tired beauty that spoke of too many double shifts and not enough sleep. "Mrs. Roberts?" "Frank Morrison from the food bank. Please come in." Her voice carried the musical accent of someone born elsewhere but raised here, each word carefully chosen. "And it's Sophia." The house's interior told a story. Frank recognized furniture that had seen better decades, walls that needed paint they couldn't afford, and the particular cleanliness that came from someone fighting to maintain dignity against overwhelming odds. But it was the blue tarp visible through the living room window that caught his attention. "Mama, who's at the door?" A boy appeared from the kitchen, all knees and elbows at 12, with his mother's dark eyes and an expression older than his. "Years. This is Miguel," Sophia said, her hand settling protectively on her son's shoulder. "Miguel, this is Mr. Morrison from Pastor Williams' food bank." Frank extended his hand, noting how the boy's grip was firm and his eye contact direct. Good parents taught those things. "Pleasure to meet you, son. Are you a Marine?" Miguel asked, his gaze fixed on Frank's tattoo. "My Uncle Carlos was a Marine before he died." Mama has his flag. Semper Fi, Frank said quietly, watching the boy's face light up. 28 years active duty. Did you fight in any wars? Miguel, Sophia warned, but Frank raised a gentle hand. It's all right, and yes, I did. Vietnam Desert Storm. Couple other places you probably haven't heard of. Frank's eyes found Sophia's. Your brother? My husband's brother. I'd in Afghanistan 2018. Her voice stayed steady, but Frank caught the slight tremor in her hands. He never got to meet the kids. Frank nodded, filing away another piece of information about the invisible wounds this family carried. He served with honor, that matters. A crash of thunder shook the house, followed immediately by the steady patter of rain against windows. Within seconds, Frank could hear the distinctive plunk-plunk of water hitting containers. Izzy, Sophia called, move the bucket under the big leak. An 8-year-old girl appeared, all pigtails and bright energy, dragging a plastic bucket toward the living room corner where water was already dripping through the ceiling. She looked up at Frank with the kind of unguarded curiosity that only children possessed. The roof leaks, she announced matter-of-factly. Mama says we can't fix it yet because fixing things costs money. Isabella, Sophia's voice carried gentle correction tinged with embarrassment. Frank knelt to Izzy's level, his old knees protesting. That's a pretty smart observation. How long has it been leaking? Forever, Izzy said with 8-year-old certainty. Well, maybe since the big storm last winter. Mama puts buckets everywhere when it rains, and sometimes we have to sleep in her room when it gets really bad. Frank straightened slowly, his mind already working. The tarp outside wasn't a temporary measure, it was all they had. He'd seen enough roofs in his time to know this one was beyond patching. Mrs. Roberts, Sophia, how bad is the damage up? There? Sophia's jaw tightened. It's manageable. We're managing. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. Frank's tone stayed gentle. Just wondering if you'd had it inspected. Sometimes what looks manageable from down here can be dangerous up there. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate the concern, but we're fine. Sophia's pride flared, the same defensive stance Frank had seen in mirrors for decades. The kids are safe. And that's what matters. Miguel looked between his mother and Frank, clearly wanting to say more, but recognizing the tension. Mr. Morrison, did you ever serve with anyone from Pennsylvania? Frank welcomed the change of subject. Quite a few. Pennsylvania breeds good Marines. Takes a certain kind of person to serve someone who puts others before themselves. I want to be a Marine someday, Miguel said, ignoring his mother's slight wince. Like Uncle Carlos. Like you. It's an honor to serve, Frank said carefully. But there are lots of ways to serve your community, your family. The important thing is finding your purpose. Another rumble of thunder emphasized the point as more water began dripping through the ceiling. Sophia moved efficiently, positioning containers with the practice of someone who'd done this too many times. I should go, Frank said, though every instinct told him to stay and help. Sophia, it was a pleasure meeting you and your family. Miguel, keep asking good questions. Izzy, keep being smart about where those buckets go. At the door, Sophia's mask slipped slightly. Mr. Morrison? Thank you. For the groceries, I mean, it helps more than you know. Frank touched the brim of his cap. We all need help sometimes. No shame in accepting it when it's offered in good faith. Walking back to his truck, Frank cast one more glance at the blue tarp and made a mental note of the address. 247 Maple Street. The rain was getting heavier, and he could only imagine what the inside of that house would look like by morning. That evening, Frank sat in his modest duplex with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at a piece of paper with a roofing company's number written in his careful script. The phone felt heavy in his arthritis-gnarled hands. Hartman Roofing, a gruff voice answered. This is Frank Morrison. I need a roof replacement done tomorrow night. Complete tear-off and replacement. Cash payment. Tomorrow night? Mr. Morrison. We don't usually. I'll pay double your usual rate. The job needs to be done overnight, and the family can't know who's paying for it. Can you handle that? A pause. Cash, you said? Cash. Full payment on completion. Address is 247 Maple Street. House has a blue tarp over the main section. You can't miss it. Mr. Morrison, if you don't mind me asking, why the secrecy? Frank looked out his window toward the direction of Maple Street, though the Roberts house wasn't visible from here. Because some gifts are harder to accept than others. And some people have already carried more than their share. The next morning, Frank arrived at the food bank to find Pastor Williams already deep in conversation with another volunteer. The pastor looked up as Frank approached, his expression thoughtful. Frank, you remember Elena Santos? She writes for the local paper. Elena was a young woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of energy that suggested she'd found her calling. Mr. Morrison, Pastor Williams tells me you've been volunteering here for 5 years. I'm doing a piece on community resilience, and I'd love to include. I'm not much for interviews, Frank said, hanging up his cap. Just here to help. Elena nodded, though her journalist's instincts clearly weren't satisfied. Of course. But if you change your mind, the community should know about people like you. Quiet heroes, you know. Frank's hand paused on the clipboard. Heroes. If she only knew. I'm no hero, Miss Santos. Just an old man trying to be useful. But as he loaded his truck for the day's deliveries, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed anonymity was becoming harder to maintain. Millbrook was a small town, and secrets had a way of refusing to stay buried. Still, as he drove past Maple Street and saw workers already positioning ladders and materials around the Roberts house, Frank allowed himself a small smile. Whatever. The cost of his secret, some things were worth the risk. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in months, the Roberts family would sleep through the night with a roof that didn't leak. Sometimes, that was enough to justify everything else. Sophia Roberts stood in her living room at 6:30. In the morning, coffee mug forgotten in her hand, staring at what had been impossible the night before. Where water-stained ceiling tiles and sagging drywall had marked years of damage. Fresh white paint gleamed under new recessed lighting. Not a single brown stain. Not a hint of the decay that had threatened to bring the whole structure down. Mama? Miguel's voice carried wonder and confusion in equal measure. What happened to our roof? Izzy bounced on her toes, pigtails dancing. It's magic. The roof fairy came. But Sophia's mind was racing with practical concerns. Professional roofing work like this complete replacement, new gutters, even what looked like upgraded insulation, would cost more than she made in 6 months. The kind of money that didn't appear overnight without strings attached. Miguel, take your sister and get ready for school. Her voice stayed calm despite the tornado of questions spinning in her head. I need to make some phone calls. The business card tucked behind the new thermostat another. Upgrade she hadn't requested. Read Hartman Roofing and Construction in simple block letters. Sophia dialed the number before she could second-guess herself. Hartman Roofing, this is. Bill, this is Sophia Roberts on Maple Street. Someone fixed my roof last night, and I need to know who paid for it. A pause long enough to confirm her suspicions. Ma'am, I can't really discuss. Mr. Hartman, I appreciate client confidentiality, but this is my home. I have 2 children here, and I need to know what obligations I've taken on. Look, Mrs. Roberts, all I can tell you is it was paid for. In full. Cash. No liens, no contracts, no obligations on your part. Whoever arranged it specifically requested anonymity. Sophia's grip tightened on the phone. How much? Ma'am, how much? Another pause. 12,000, plus materials. The number hit her like a physical blow. $15,000 minimum. More than her annual salary at the hospital cafeteria. More than her late husband's life insurance had paid out after. The medical bills. Mrs. Roberts, you still there? Who has that kind of money in Millbrook? She asked, though she wasn't really expecting an answer. Someone who wanted your family to be safe, Bill Hartman said gently. That's all I know, and that's all they wanted me to know. After hanging up, Sophia sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, the one luxury she'd maintained because Miguel needed it for school. Her search for anonymous charitable donations, Millbrook, PA, yielded surprisingly little. The town's foundation had been dissolved 3 years ago when the last major employer left. The few remaining businesses barely kept their doors open. A knock at the door interrupted her research. Elena Santos stood on her newly repaired porch, notebook in hand and curiosity bright in her eyes. Mrs. Roberts? I'm Elena Santos from the Millbrook Tribune. I heard about your roof repair and wondered if I could ask a few questions. Sophia studied the young woman. She'd seen Elena around town, knew she'd grown up here before leaving for college and coming back to document their community's decline. How did you hear about it? Small town, Elena said with a smile. New roofs don't appear overnight without people noticing. Mind if I come in? Over coffee, Elena's questions were gentle but persistent. Have you had any contact with local charities? Any applications pending for home repair assistance? I tried everything, Sophia admitted. Habitat for Humanity has a 3-year waiting list. The county emergency fund was exhausted last winter. I even called the VA because my brother-in-law was a veteran, but they said it only applies to direct family. Elena made notes, her journalistic instincts clearly engaged. What about wealthy individuals? Anyone in town with the resources for this kind of gesture? Sophia laughed, but there was no humor in it. Elena, you grew up here. Who in Millbrook has $15,000 lying around for anonymous charity? That was the question haunting both women. Elena had spent months documenting the town's economic collapse, the closed factories, the exodus of young families, the slow strangulation of hope. The few remaining businesses operated on thin margins, and most of the older residents lived on fixed incomes that barely covered necessities. There has to be someone, Elena mused. This level of work, done overnight, paid in cash. Whoever arranged this has serious resources and wanted complete secrecy. After Elena left, Sophia tried to return to her normal routine, but everything felt different. The house was quieter without the constant drip of water, warmer without the drafts that had made winter unbearable. But the comfort came with a weight she couldn't shake. At the hospital that afternoon, Sophia found herself distracted during her shift. As they prepared for lunch service, Mrs. Chun noticed Sophia seemed distracted. Something bothering you, Sophia? Everything okay at home? She asked gently. Sophia hesitated, then opened up about her situation. Mrs. Chen listened with the calm attentiveness of someone who had lived long enough to understand the layers behind people's actions. Anonymous generosity can be harder to accept than open charity, she said thoughtfully. When we don't know why someone gives, we often project our own doubts and fears onto it. I just can't figure out who would help us like that, or why, Sophia admitted. Mrs. Cheen smiled as she adjusted a stack of lunch trays. Maybe it was someone who knows what it's like to carry heavy burdens alone. The most generous people are often those who've learned the price of pride. Later that evening, Miguel pulled Sophia aside in the kitchen. Mom, I've been thinking about the new roof, he said. Oh? Remember when Mr. Morrison came by yesterday and asked about the leak? You kind of snapped at him. Sophia paused mid-prep, realizing her son was right. She had reacted defensively. What are you thinking, Miguel? He seemed really concerned. Like, not just being nice, and the way he looked at the tarp? Plus, Uncle Carlos always said Marines look out for each other. Miguel, Mr. Morrison works at a food bank. That doesn't mean he can afford to pay for a roof, she replied, though even as she spoke, doubt crept in. She remembered Elena mentioning something odd. Frank Morrison had volunteered in Millbrook for 5 years, yet no one knew where he'd come from. In a small town where everyone knew each other's past, that kind of mystery required deliberate effort. Just then, a message from Alina buzzed on Sophia's phone. Found something about your mystery donor. Can we meet tomorrow? Sophia stared at the screen, torn. Some answers, once pursued, can't be undone. But as she glanced around her now dry, warm home and thought of her peacefully sleeping children, she knew she couldn't ignore it. Yes, she replied. I need to know. At the end of Maple Street, Frank Morrison sat quietly in his truck, watching the Roberts family through lit windows. He saw them going about their evening in safety and warmth. His phone rang. It was Dr. Chun. Frank, we need to go over your test results. Can you come in tomorrow? He closed his eyes, already anticipating the worst. His carefully built wall of anonymity was beginning to crumble. Elena Santos had started asking around, and Sophia Roberts didn't seem like the kind to stop digging. Tomorrow afternoon, he said, and ended the call. He drove home to his modest duplex, the weight of his secrets heavier than ever. The rain had finally stopped. For the first time in months, the Roberts family would sleep through the night without worry, but Frank knew their peace came at the start of a different kind of storm. Dr. Margaret Chun's office felt more cramped than usual, the silence pressing in like heavy air. Frank sat calmly, though his hands, once steady now, occasionally trembled with stress. Between them sat a manila folder, thick with truths. The cancer's spreading more quickly than we hoped, Dr. Chun said gently. You might have 6 months, maybe 8, if we begin treatment. Frank nodded slowly. The pain in his chest and his growing fatigue had already told him what he needed to know. And the treatment. What would it give me? A few more weeks of feeling even worse. Maybe, but Frank, there are people who care about you, Pastor Williams. The volunteers. They care about Gunny Morrison. Frank cut in, voice tinged with bitterness. The helpful old Marine. They don't know Franklin J. Morrison. 3. Dr. Chun leaned back, startled by the full name. In all the years she'd treated his depression, and now, cancer, he'd never mentioned it. He rarely spoke of family, only vague allusions to his military life. Frank, what aren't you telling me? The afternoon light filtered through the blinds, and Frank was suddenly transported to a memory from nearly 3 decades earlier. He had been in another doctor's office, holding his newborn grandson for the first time. Marcus had been perfect 8 pounds, 2 ounces, a bundle of potential. His daughter Victoria had glowed with tired joy, and even David, his son-in-law, looked less overwhelmed as the baby gripped his finger tightly. He's strong, Frank had said, beaming. Look at that grip. Just promise me he won't follow your path into the military, Victoria had said, half joking. The world's dangerous enough. Frank had laughed then, picturing birthday parties, Little League games, graduations. A simple, steady life, one that no Morrison had managed in generations. Frank? Dr. Chun's voice pulled him back. Chun's voice brought him back to the present. I had a grandson, Frank said quietly. Marcus, he died in Afghanistan 7 years ago. Dr. Chun waited, recognizing the careful way Frank parceled out pieces of his past. He was 22. Second lieutenant, fresh out of Quantico. Wanted to serve his country, carry on the family tradition. Frank's voice grew rougher. I'd took out his convoy outside Kandahar. Killed 3 Marines instantly, wounded 2 others. I'm sorry, Frank, losing a grandchild. The body armor failed. The words came out like broken glass. Defective plates. The shrapnel went right through where it should have stopped. Marcus died because some defense contractor cut corners. To save a few dollars per unit. Frank stood and walked to the window, looking out at Millbrook's struggling Main Street. What I didn't tell you, Doctor, is that the contractor was Morrison Defense Industries, my family's company. The armor that failed my grandson, my family built it. The silence stretched between them until Dr. Chun spoke carefully. "Frank, you couldn't have known. I signed off on the cost-cutting measures." Frank's reflection in the window looked older than his 82 years. "Not the technical specs, I left that to the engineers. But when they came to me with proposals to reduce manufacturing costs, I approved them. Trusted that someone else would ensure quality control." The phone call had come at 3:47 a.m., Pentagon time. Frank had been in his Alexandria mansion, having just returned from a corporate dinner where Morrison Defense had celebrated another successful quarter. Victoria's voice had been hollow, mechanical. "Dad, it's Marcus. He's gone." The details had come later: the convoy, the IED, the way Marcus had tried to shield a younger Marine, even as his own armor failed him. But in that moment, Frank had known with terrible certainty that his world had just ended. The investigation had been thorough and damning. 67 Marines had died wearing Morrison defense armor that didn't meet its own specifications. The scandal had cost the company $800 million in settlements and criminal fines. Victoria, as CEO, had handled the crisis with corporate efficiency, treating it as a public relations problem to be managed. Frank had attended every funeral he could, facing families who had no idea the man offering condolences was partially responsible for their loss. He'd listened to mothers weep, fathers rage, children ask why daddy wasn't coming home. Each service had carved away another piece of his soul. After the funerals, Frank continued, "I couldn't be in that house anymore. Couldn't sign another contract or attend another board meeting. I gave Victoria control of everything and disappeared." "That's when you came to Millbrook?" Frank nodded. "Found the smallest, most forgotten place I could. Figured I'd done enough damage to last several lifetimes." Dr. Chun studied him with new understanding. "But you've been helping people here. The food bank, the anonymous donations, blood money," Frank said simply. "All of it. Every dollar I inherited, every dividend payment, every capital gain. It's all built on Marcus's death and 66 other boys who trusted equipment my family made." The weight of Frank's confession settled between them. Outside Millbrook continued its slow decline, unaware that one of America's wealthiest men was dying quietly in their midst, carrying the guilt of decisions that had killed his own grandson. "Frank, what you've done for this community doesn't change what my family's company did." Frank returned to his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 82 years. "But maybe it's something. Maybe it's better than hiding the money in banks while people like Sophia Roberts risk their children's safety because they can't afford a roof." Dr. Chun made a note in Frank's file, but Frank knew it wasn't medical. "Have you told anyone else about this?" "Pastor Williams suspects something. He's got good instincts about people carrying heavy loads." Frank managed a weak smile. "And there's a journalist sniffing around. Elena Santos. She's young but thorough. What will you do if she discovers your identity?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, remembering Miguel's excitement about Marines, Izzy's innocent trust, Sophia's fierce pride. "I don't know. Part of me hopes she does. This secret is eating me alive faster than the cancer." "And the other part?" "The other part knows that once people learn who I really am, everything changes. The help I can give them becomes tainted by what my family took away from other families." Frank stood to leave. "How do you ask people to accept blood money, doctor? How do you explain that your generosity comes from the same source as their suffering?" Dr. Chun didn't have an answer, and Frank didn't expect one. Some questions weren't meant to be solved, only carried. As Frank left the medical building, his phone buzzed with a text from Pastor Williams. "Elena Santos was asking more questions about you today. Says she's doing a story on community heroes. Thought you should know." Frank looked up at the gray Pennsylvania sky and felt the weight of 27 years of guilt pressing down on his chest. Heroes, the irony was almost too much to bear. Somewhere in town, Alina Santos was digging deeper into his carefully constructed anonymity. Somewhere else, Sophia Roberts was asking questions about her mysterious benefactor. And in Frank's modest duplex, a folder full of bank statements and financial documents waited in a locked drawer, evidence of a fortune built on the graves of young Marines. The storm he'd been dreading was finally coming, and Frank Morrison was no longer sure he had the strength to weather it alone. Frank's collapse came without warning on a Thursday morning at the food bank. One moment he was stacking canned goods with his usual methodical precision. The next he was on his knees, clutching his chest as pain radiated through his body like shrapnel. Pastor Williams reached him first, his former military chaplain training kicking in as he assessed Frank's condition. "Easy, Frank, just breathe." Pastor Williams' voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd talked dying soldiers through their last moments. "I'm calling an ambulance." "No." Frank's voice was barely a whisper, but the intensity stopped Pastor Williams mid-dial. "Dr. Chun. Call Dr. Chun." The pastor's eyes narrowed, recognizing something in Frank's tone that spoke of secrets and complications beyond a simple medical emergency. "Frank, you need, please." Frank's grip on Pastor Williams' arm was surprisingly strong for a man having a cardiac episode. "Trust me." 20 minutes later, Dr. Chun arrived at the food bank instead of an ambulance, her medical bag in one hand and a look of resigned understanding on her face. She knelt beside Frank, checking his pulse and breathing while Pastor Williams watched with growing concern. "It's not his heart," Dr. Chun said quietly, injecting something into Frank's arm that eased the visible tension in his face. "Frank, you should have told me the pain was getting this severe." Pastor Williams looked between them, the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form. "How long have you two been managing this together?" Dr. Chun glanced at Frank, who nodded weakly. "David, perhaps we should talk privately." The three of them moved to Pastor Williams' small office behind the food bank, Frank leaning heavily on Dr. Chun's arm. The pain medication had helped, but Frank looked frailer than Pastor Williams had ever seen him, as if some internal structure had finally given way. "Frank has terminal cancer," Dr. Chun said without preamble. "Pancreatic. 6 months, possibly less given today's episode." Pastor Williams absorbed this information with the practiced calm of someone who delivered his share of devastating news to military families. "How long have you known?" "Officially?" 3 months. Frank's voice was steadier now, though he remained pale. "Unofficially?" "I've been ignoring symptoms for over a year. Why didn't you tell me?" The hurt in Pastor Williams' voice was carefully controlled. "Frank, we've worked together for 5 years. I thought we were friends." "We are." Frank met his eyes directly. "But friendship has limits when the truth could destroy everything you've built here." Pastor Williams studied Frank's face, noting the careful way he chose his words, the weight of unspoken burdens that went beyond terminal illness. "What truth, Frank?" Dr. Chun looked to Frank, who nodded again. The secret was becoming too heavy for one dying man to carry alone. "Tell him about Marcus," Dr. Chun said gently. The next hour unfolded like a confession that had been building pressure for 7 years. Frank told Pastor Williams about his grandson, about Morrison Defense Industries, about armor that failed and families destroyed. He spoke about sitting in his Alexandria mansion after Marcus's funeral, surrounded by wealth built on military contracts, unable to bear the weight of his inheritance. Pastor Williams listened without interruption, his chaplain training helping him recognize the difference between guilt and genuine responsibility. When Frank finished, the office fell silent except for the distant sounds of volunteers continuing the food bank's work. "You've been carrying this alone," Pastor Williams said finally. It wasn't a question. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Who else could I tell?" The family's here struggling to put food on the table while I sit on billions earned from military contracts. The veterans who respect me because they think I'm just another old Marine who served his country. You did serve your country, Frank. 30 years in the Corps. And then I became part of a system that killed the men I'd trained to trust their equipment. Frank's voice cracked. How do you reconcile that, David? How do you tell Miguel Roberts that his hero's family is responsible for dead Marines? Pastor Williams was quiet for a long moment, processing the moral complexity of Frank's situation. Outside the office, they could hear Elena Santos interviewing volunteers about Frank's community contributions, her investigation continuing despite his absence. The money you've been using for charity, Pastor Williams said slowly. All of it comes from Morrison Defense. Every dollar. Blood money, as clean as I can make it, but still tainted by its source. Frank struggled to his feet, needing to move despite his weakness. That's why I can't just write a check to save this town. How do I ask people to take money earned from the deaths of their sons and brothers? Dr. Chun spoke up from where she'd been quietly observing. Frank, you're not responsible for every decision Morrison Defense ever made. I approved the cost-cutting measures that led to defective armor. I signed off on prioritizing profit margins over quality control. Frank's honesty was brutal in its precision. Maybe I didn't know the specific technical details, but I created the environment where those decisions could be made. Pastor Williams stood and walked to his window, looking out at the food bank's modest operation. Frank, in 5 years of working here, you've helped feed hundreds of families. You've quietly paid medical bills, school fees, utility deposits. You've done more good in this town than anyone else I know. Using money that shouldn't exist, Frank replied. Profit from other people's suffering. And yet Sophia Roberts' children are sleeping safely under a roof that doesn't leak, Pastor Williams pointed out. Tommy Rodriguez's construction business has steady work for the first time in years. The Henderson family didn't lose their house to medical bankruptcy because someone anonymously paid their debt. Frank slumped back into his chair, the medication wearing off and pain beginning to reassert itself. Does the source of good deeds matter if the outcome helps people? That's a question theologians have debated for centuries, Pastor Williams admitted. But I'll tell you what I know from 30 years of military chaplaincy. Guilt can be a useful tool for change, but it's a terrible foundation for a life. Dr. Chun checked her watch. Frank, you need rest. And stronger pain medication than what I can provide here. No hospitals, Frank said firmly. Too many questions, too much paperwork. If Elena Santos discovers I'm Franklin Morrison while I'm laid up in a hospital bed, the story breaks before I can control how it's told. Pastor Williams frowned. You think she's that close? She's smart and persistent, and she's asking the right questions. Frank accepted Dr. Chun's help standing. Plus, Sophia Roberts isn't the type to let mystery slide. Between the two of them, my cover won't last another week. As they prepared to leave the food bank, Pastor Williams caught Frank's arm. Frank, whatever happens with your secret, you're not facing this alone anymore. Dr. Chun and I will help you figure out the right path forward. Frank nodded, though his expression remained troubled. The right path might be the most painful one, David. Once people know who I really am, everything changes. The good I've done here gets overshadowed by the harm my family caused elsewhere. Maybe, Pastor Williams acknowledged. Or maybe this community will surprise you. People here understand that life is complicated, that good and evil aren't always clearly separated. Outside, Elena Santos was finishing her interviews, her notebook full of glowing testimonials about Frank Morrison's community spirit. But Pastor Williams could see the calculating look in her eyes, the expression of a journalist sensing a larger story lurking beneath the surface. Frank's secret was indeed living on borrowed time. The question now was whether he would reveal it on his own terms, or whether the truth would be uncovered by others who might not understand the full complexity of his burden. As Dr. Chun helped Frank to her car, Pastor Williams whispered a prayer. For wisdom. Some secrets were meant to be kept, others demanded to be told. Frank Morrison's fell somewhere in the dangerous space between, where revelation could heal or destroy in equal measure. The weight of that choice was about to become heavier than one dying man could bear alone. Elena Santos had always been good at following threads that others missed, a skill honed by years of investigating stories that mattered in a world that often preferred convenient lies to uncomfortable truths. But the Frank Morrison mystery was proving more complex than any story she'd tackled since returning to Millbrook. The breakthrough came at 2:17 a.m. on a Friday night, when insomnia and journalistic obsession finally paid off. Elena sat in her cramped apartment above the bakery, surrounded by printouts, notes, and 3 empty coffee cups, staring at a bank routing number that had appeared in connection with Tommy Rodriguez's sudden influx of construction contracts. The number belonged to Morrison Financial Holdings. Elena's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, following a digital paper trail that led through shell companies and charitable trusts to a name that made her breath catch: Morrison Defense Industries, one of the largest military contractors in the United States, with annual revenues in the billions and a recent history shadowed by a major scandal involving defective body armor. Franklin J. Morrison III, she whispered to her empty apartment, reading the corporate filings that listed him as the primary beneficiary of the Morrison Family Trust. The man was worth an estimated $4.2 billion, with holdings in defense contracting, real estate, and technology. But according to every database she could access, Franklin Morrison III had effectively vanished from public life 7 years ago, shortly after the armor scandal that had cost Morrison Defense nearly $1 billion in settlements and criminal fines. Elena leaned back in her chair, pieces clicking into place with nauseating clarity. Frank Morrison, the humble food bank volunteer who lived in a duplex and drove a 15-year-old pickup truck, was one of the wealthiest men in America. More disturbing was the timeline. His disappearance from corporate life coincided exactly with the defective armor scandal that had killed dozens of Marines. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophia Roberts. "Found something. Can you meet me at Tommy's shop tomorrow morning?" Elena glanced at the clock, then at the pile of evidence spread across her desk. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether to continue investigating or confront Frank directly. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of what she'd uncovered. The next morning found Elena and Sophia standing in Tommy Rodriguez's cluttered construction office, watching the burly contractor pace nervously behind his desk. Tommy had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working with his hands, but his expression carried the uncertainty of a man confronting something beyond his experience. "Ladies, I'll be straight with you because I can't make sense of this alone," Tommy began, pulling out a manila folder thick with paperwork. "For the past 6 months, I've been getting contracts I never bid on. Good-paying work, all paid in cash, all requested by the same mysterious client." Sophia leaned forward. "The same person who fixed our roof?" "Has to be. Same pattern, anonymous request, cash payment, demand for complete secrecy about the client's identity." Tommy spread the documents across his desk. "But here's the thing that's been eating at me. The total value of these contracts is over $200,000. Elena felt her stomach tighten. $200,000? "Tommy, who in Millbrook has that kind of money?" "That's what I couldn't figure out. Until yesterday." Tommy pulled out a bank deposit slip. "I always deposit the cash payments the same day I receive them. Yesterday, my bank manager mentioned something about the serial numbers on some of the bills." "Serial numbers?" Sophia asked. "Consecutive serial numbers, all from the same Federal Reserve batch. The kind of pattern you see when someone withdraws large amounts of cash from institutional accounts." Tommy's voice dropped. "Bank manager said it was the Kind of thing you'd see if someone was deliberately trying to avoid creating paper trails. Elena's mind raced. Tommy, did you keep records of when you received each payment? Of course. Maria handles all the bookkeeping. Tommy called toward the back office. Maria, can you bring Elena that timeline we put together? Maria Rodriguez emerged from the back office, a slight woman with sharp eyes and the meticulous attention to detail that kept their struggling business afloat. She handed Elena a typed sheet that listed every anonymous contract Tommy had received, with dates and payment amounts. Elena studied the timeline, her journalist's instincts recognizing a pattern. Tommy, look at this. The payments always come right after you mention financial problems around town. The Henderson medical bills, the Wilson's roof repair, Mrs. Patterson's heating system. Every time someone in Millbrook faces a crisis, you get a contract within days. Like someone's monitoring the town's problems and responding through my business, Tommy realized. But who would do that? And why use me? Sophia answered quietly. Because you're a veteran. Because people trust you. Because using your business gives the help legitimacy, makes it look like honest work instead of charity. Elena felt the final pieces clicking into place. Tommy, do you remember when these anonymous contracts started? Tommy consulted his records. First one was March 15th, about 6 months ago. Right after Frank Morrison started volunteering. At the food bank. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Elena looked at Sophia, seeing her own suspicions reflected in the other woman's face. There's something else, Maria said quietly from the doorway. Tommy, tell them about the specifications. Tommy shifted uncomfortably. The work requests always come with very specific instructions. Not just what to fix, but how to fix it. Military-grade materials when possible. Emphasis on long-term durability over cost savings. Like whoever's paying for this understands the difference between cheap fixes and permanent solutions. Military experience, Elena murmured. And the cash always comes with a note, Maria added. Same handwriting every time. Always says, for services rendered with honor. What veteran talks like that? Elena's phone buzzed with a news alert that made her blood run cold. She read it twice before speaking. Tommy, Sophia, there's something else you need to know about Morrison Defense Industries. She pulled up the article on her phone, a retrospective piece about military contractor accountability. 7 years ago, Morrison Defense paid $800 million in settlements for defective body armor that failed in combat. 67. Marines died wearing equipment that didn't meet specifications. Sophia's face went pale. Elena, what are you saying? I'm saying that if Frank Morrison is really Franklin Morrison III, then every dollar he spent helping Millbrook comes from profit made on military contracts, including the ones that got soldiers killed. Tommy sank into his chair, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. Jesus, you're telling me I've been taking blood money? We don't know anything for certain yet, Elena said, though her voice lacked conviction. But the timeline fits, the resources fit, and the behavior fits. A man with that much guilt might retreat from public life and try to do good works anonymously. Sophia stood abruptly, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. I need to go home. I need to think about this. Sophia, wait, Elena called. What are you going to do? Sophia paused at the door, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. How do you thank someone for saving your family if that person's wealth comes from destroying other families? After Sophia left, Tommy and Elena sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Tommy spoke. Elena, if you publish this story, it destroys him. Frank's a good man, whatever his past might be. And if I don't publish it, I'm complicit in hiding the truth from a community that deserves to know where their help is coming from. Elena gathered her notes, feeling the weight of the decision ahead. Tommy, Frank Morrison, whoever he really is, has been using your business to distribute what amounts to guilt money. Don't you think people have a right to know that? Tommy was quiet for a long moment. I think Frank Morrison is dying, Elena. I've seen enough sick veterans to recognize the signs. And I think he's trying to do something good with whatever time he has left, using money earned from dead soldiers. Maybe, but those soldiers are already dead, and that money already exists. If Frank's using it to help families like the Roberts, does the source really matter? Elena didn't have an answer. As she walked back to her car, she realized that the story she'd been chasing had become something far more complex than a simple human interest piece about anonymous charity. She was holding the power to destroy a man who might be seeking genuine redemption, or to expose a truth that a struggling community might not want to hear. Her phone rang. Sophia Roberts. Elena, I need to ask you something. If you were Miguel, and you discovered that your hero's money came from the deaths of soldiers, what would you want to know? Elena closed her eyes, knowing that the answer to that question would determine not just her story, but the fate of Frank Morrison's carefully constructed redemption. Everything, she said finally. I'd want to know everything. Then we need to confront him, Sophia said. Before someone else discovers the truth and tells it without understanding what it means. Elena started her car, heading toward Frank Morrison's duplex with the weight of revelation heavy in her chest. Some stories chose their own ending, and this one was demanding to be told. The black limousine looked like a predator among sheep. As it glided down Millbrook's potholed Main Street, Elena spotted it from 2 blocks away as she drove toward Frank's duplex, its corporate sleekness so foreign to the town's working-class aesthetic that it might as well have been from another planet. By the time she parked across from Frank's modest home, a small crowd had gathered on nearby porches, neighbors emerging to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. The woman who stepped from the limousine moved with the calculated precision of someone accustomed to boardrooms and hostile takeovers. Victoria Morrison Ashworth was younger than Elena had expected, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked auburn hair pulled into a severe chignon and a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than most Millbrook residents made in a month. She carried herself like someone who'd never doubted her right to be anywhere she chose to be. Elena recognized her immediately from business publications, though seeing Victoria in person was different. The corporate headshots had captured her professional competence but missed the underlying steel, the sense of barely contained fury that radiated from her as she approached Frank's front door. "This is private property," Victoria announced when she noticed Elena getting out of her car. "I suggest you move along. I'm Elena Santos from the Millbrook Tribune. Are you here about Frank Morrison?" Victoria's eyes narrowed, assessing Elena with the quick calculation of someone who dealt with media before. "No comment. This is a family matter." But Elena had already noticed the corporate logo on the limousine door, Morrison Defense Industries. The final piece of confirmation she'd needed, delivered in chrome and leather luxury to Frank's doorstep. Victoria knocked sharply on Frank's door, the sound echoing like gunshots in the quiet neighborhood. When Frank answered, Elena was close enough to see his face go pale, then settle into resigned acceptance. "Hello, Victoria. Don't hello, Victoria me." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to obedience. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've cost the company? The family?" Frank stepped aside to let her enter, glancing across the street at Elena before closing the door. But the duplex's thin walls and Victoria's increasingly elevated voice made their conversation audible to anyone listening carefully. Elena positioned herself near Frank's front window, her journalistic ethics warring with her need to understand the story unfolding inside. Sophia Roberts appeared at her shoulder, having arrived just as the limousine had. "That's her, isn't it?" Sophia whispered. "His family." Elena nodded, straining to hear the heated conversation inside. Unauthorized charitable expenditures totaling over $3 million in the past 6 months alone. Victoria's voice carried clearly through the window. Franklin, the board is demanding answers. You can't just disappear and start hemorrhaging family money on whatever guilt-driven charity strikes your fancy. Frank's reply was quieter, but Alina caught fragments. My money to distribute, and not your concern how I. It absolutely is my concern when your little redemption project threatens everything our family built. Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. Do you have any idea what the media would do with this story? Billionaire defense contractor playing Santa Claus in Rust Belt Town. They'd crucify us. Alina and Sophia exchanged glances. Billionaire. The confirmation hung in the air between them like smoke. I saw the contractor reports, Franklin. Roofing jobs, VAC systems, medical bill payments. You're trying to buy your way into heaven with blood money, and it won't work. At least I'm trying to do something with it, instead of what? Running the company that employs 12,000 people? Managing the contracts that keep our military properly equipped? Taking responsibility for the family. Legacy instead of wallowing in self-pity. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor made Alina flinch. Through the window, she could see Frank leaning against the wall, one hand pressed to his chest. Franklin? Victoria's voice lost some of its edge. I'm dying, Victoria. Frank's words were quiet but carried clearly. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. The silence that followed stretched like a held breath. When? Victoria spoke again. Her voice was different, smaller, more human. Why didn't you tell me? When? In between your quarterly reports and board meetings? When would you have had time to care about your father's mortality? Alina heard movement. Inside, the sound of someone sitting heavily in a chair. You always blamed me for Marcus, Victoria said, her corporate armor finally cracking. As if I pulled the trigger myself. You prioritized profit margins over quality control. The armor that failed Marcus came from specifications you approved. I approved cost-saving measures recommended by our engineers. I trusted our quality assurance teams to maintain standards while reducing expenses. That's what CEOs do. Franklin, we make decisions based on expert advice. And when those decisions kill people, we take responsibility, pay the settlements, improve our processes, and move forward. That's how the real world works. Victoria's voice hardened again. What we don't do is abandon our responsibilities and play hermit in forgotten towns while the company struggles with the aftermath. Frank's voice, when it came, carried 7 years of accumulated pain. I couldn't look at another contract without seeing Marcus's face. Couldn't attend another board meeting without thinking about the other families we'd destroyed. So I left, and left me to clean up the mess. To face the congressional hearings, the media circus, the families of dead Marines. I handled it all. While you disappeared to nurse your guilt. You handled it like a PR crisis, corporate damage control. Because that's what it was. Franklin, we couldn't bring those Marines back, but we could ensure the company survived to do better. My corporate damage control saved 12,000 jobs and funded the research that's kept armor defects from happening again. Alina found herself holding her breath, witnessing a family's reckoning with tragedy and responsibility. Sophia gripped her arm, both women drawn into the raw emotional exchange happening beyond the thin walls. The money you've been spending here, Victoria, continued, it's not going to resurrect Marcus. It's not going to absolve you of whatever guilt you're carrying. All it's doing is threatening everything he died believing in. What are you talking about? Marcus enlisted despite our wealth, Franklin. He chose service over privilege, duty, over comfort. He believed in something bigger than himself, bigger than our family's money. And you're dishonoring that by trying to buy redemption with the very fortune he rejected. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Alina could hear Frank's labored breathing, the sound of a man confronting a truth he hadn't considered. Victoria. Come home, Dad. The word dad emerged like something painful being extracted. Come back to the company. Help me turn Morrison Defense into something Marcus would be proud of. Use your remaining time to build a legacy, not to hide from. 1. I can't. Because of your guilt? Because of this town. Because of Sophia Roberts and her children sleeping safely under a roof I paid for. Because of Tommy Rodriguez keeping his business alive with my contracts. Because for the first time in 7 years, I'm not just trying to atone for Marcus's death, I'm trying to honor his life. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Victoria's heels crossing the wooden floor. You have 1 week, Franklin. Either you return to your responsibilities, or I'll have you declared mentally incompetent. And take control of your assets. The family can't afford to let you destroy everything out of misplaced guilt. The front door opened with enough force to rattle the frame. Victoria emerged, her composure restored but her eyes carrying a hint of the pain Elena had heard in her voice. She walked to her limousine without acknowledging the small crowd that had gathered. As the black car disappeared down Millbrook's main street, Elena and Sophia remained frozen by Frank's window. Inside, they could hear the sound of an old man weeping for losses that money couldn't restore and wounds that time couldn't heal. Sophia was the first to move, walking to Frank's front door and knocking gently. "Mr. Morrison, it's Sophia Roberts. I think we need to talk." His time to know this one was beyond patching. "Mrs. Roberts, Sophia, how bad is the damage up there?" Sophia's jaw tightened. "It's manageable. We're managing." "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." Frank's tone stayed gentle. "Just wondering if you'd had it inspected. Sometimes what looks manageable from down here can be dangerous up there." "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate the concern, but we're fine." Sophia's pride flared, the same defensive stance Frank had seen in mirrors for decades. "The kids are safe, and that's what matters." Miguel looked between his mother and Frank, clearly wanting to say more but recognizing the tension. "Mr. Morrison, did you ever serve with anyone from Pennsylvania?" Frank welcomed the change of subject. "Quite a few. Pennsylvania breeds good Marines. Takes a certain kind of person to serve someone who puts others before themselves." "I want to be a Marine someday," Miguel said, ignoring his mother's slight wince. "Like Uncle Carlos, like you." "It's an honor to serve," Frank said carefully. "But there are lots of ways to serve your community, your family. The important thing is finding your purpose." Another rumble of thunder emphasized the point as more water began dripping through the ceiling. Sophia moved efficiently, positioning containers with the practice of someone who'd done this too many times. "I should go," Frank said, though every instinct told him to stay and help. "Sophia, it was a pleasure meeting you and your family. Miguel, keep asking good questions. Izzy, keep being smart about where those buckets go." At the door, Sophia's mask slipped slightly. "Mr. Morrison? Thank you. For the groceries, I mean. It helps more than you know." Frank touched the brim of his cap. "We all need help sometimes. No shame in accepting it when it's offered in good faith." Walking back to his truck, Frank cast one more glance at the blue tarp and made a mental note of the address, 247 Maple Street. The rain was getting heavier, and he could only imagine what the inside of that house would look like by morning. That evening, Frank sat in his modest duplex with a cup of coffee. Gone cold, staring at a piece of paper with a roofing company's number written in his careful script. The phone felt heavy in his arthritis-gnarled hands. "Hartman Roofing," a gruff voice answered. "This is Frank Morrison. I need a roof replacement done tomorrow night. Complete tear-off and replacement. Cash payment. Tomorrow night?" "Mr. Morrison, we don't usually. I'll pay double your usual rate. The job needs to be done overnight, and the family can't know who's paying for it. Can you handle that?" A pause. "Cash, you said?" "Cash. Full payment on completion. Address is 247 Maple Street. House has a blue tarp over the main section. You can't miss it." Mr. Morrison, if you don't mind me asking, why the secrecy? Frank looked out his window toward the direction of Maple Street, though the Roberts house wasn't visible from here. Because some gifts are harder to accept than others. And some people have already carried more than their share. The next morning, Frank arrived at the food bank to find Pastor Williams already deep in conversation with another volunteer. The pastor looked up as Frank approached, his expression thoughtful. "Frank, you remember Elena Santos? She writes for the local paper." Elena was a young woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of energy that suggested she'd found her calling. "Mr. Morrison, Pastor Williams tells me you've been volunteering here for 5 years. I'm doing a piece on community resilience, and I'd love to include." "I'm not much for interviews," Frank said, hanging up his cap. "Just here to help." Elena nodded, though her journalist's instincts clearly weren't satisfied. "Of course. But if you change your mind, the community should know about people like you. Quiet heroes, you know." Frank's hand paused on the clipboard. "Heroes. If she only knew. I'm no hero, Miss Santos. Just an old man trying to be useful." But as he loaded his truck for the day's deliveries, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed anonymity was becoming harder to maintain. Millbrook was a small town, and secrets had a way of refusing to stay buried. Still, as he drove past Maple Street and saw workers already positioning ladders and materials around the Roberts house, Frank allowed himself a small smile. Whatever. The cost of his secret, some things were worth the risk. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in months, the Roberts family would sleep through the night with a roof that didn't leak. Sometimes that was enough to justify everything else. Frank opened the door with the hollow look of a man who'd been stripped of his last defenses. His face was pale, streaked with tears he'd stopped trying to hide, and his hands trembled slightly as he stepped aside to let Sophia enter. Elena followed without being invited, her journalist's instincts overriding social courtesy. "You heard," Frank said. It wasn't a question. Sophia nodded, studying the modest interior of the duplex with new eyes. The sparse furniture, the single military photograph on the mantel, the careful simplicity of a man trying to live without the weight of his wealth. Some of it enough. Frank moved to his kitchen table, gesturing for them to sit. Elena noticed the prescription bottles lined up with military precision, the careful organization of someone managing a terminal illness alone. "I suppose you have questions." "Just one," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her. "Hands. Are you really Franklin Morrison III?" Frank closed his eyes, the last of his carefully constructed anonymity crumbling. "Yes." Elena felt her breath catch despite having suspected this for days. Hearing the confirmation was different, raw, and immediate and devastating in its simplicity. "The Morrison Defense Industries." "Morrison?" Sophia pressed. "The same company that manufactured the defective armor that killed my grandson and 66 other Marines." "Yes." Frank's voice carried no self-pity, just the flat recitation of facts that had defined his guilt for 7 years. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "And the money you've been using to help families here comes from military contracts, some of which failed the people they were meant to protect." Frank met her eyes directly. "Blood money." As my daughter so eloquently put it, Elena found her voice. "Frank, why didn't you just reveal your identity from the beginning? Why the secrecy?" Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because I've seen what happens when a Morrison enters a community. Corporate assessments, property value speculation, people changing their behavior because they think there's money to be gained. I wanted to help Millbrook, not transform it into another place where wealth corrupts relationships." "So you decided to help anonymously," Sophia said. "I decided to try to do something useful with money that should never have existed in the first place." Frank struggled to his feet, moving to the window that looked out toward the abandoned steel mill. "After Marcus died, after I learned that my family's corner cutting had killed him, I couldn't bear to be around the money anymore. But I also couldn't bear to just let it sit in banks while people suffered. Elena pulled out her notebook, then thought better of it. This wasn't an interview anymore, it was a confession, and it deserved to be heard without the filter of journalism. The families of the Marines who died, Sophia said carefully. Do they know about your charity work? Frank shook his head. How could I tell them? I'm sorry my family's company killed your son, but I'm using the profit from that contract to fix roofs in Pennsylvania? It would be an insult to their grief. But you're dying, Elena said gently. What happens to all of this when you're gone? I've been working with Pastor Williams and Dr. Chun to establish a foundation, community-controlled, transparent funding sources disclosed. The idea was to transition from my direct involvement to something sustainable. Frank returned to the table, his movements careful and pained. But Victoria's ultimatum changes everything. Sophia leaned forward. What ultimatum? Frank explained his daughter's threat: return to corporate life or face legal action to remove him from control of his assets. She has the resources and the legal standing to do it. If she succeeds, every dollar I've spent here gets clawed back as unauthorized expenditures. The weight of this settled over them like a shroud. Elena could see Sophia's mind working through the implications, not just losing Frank's help, but potentially having to repay money already spent on roof repairs, medical bills, and construction contracts. There's another option, Frank said quietly. I could reveal my identity publicly, establish legal protection for the charitable work through full disclosure. Make it impossible for Victoria to undo what's already been done. But, Sophia prompted. But then everyone in Millbrook learns that their mysterious benefactor is a man whose family's company killed Marines. Some of those Marines probably came from families right here in Pennsylvania. The help I've given becomes tainted by its source. Elena felt the moral complexity of the situation settling over her like a weight. Frank, if you reveal your identity, how do you think the community would react? Honestly, I think some people would tell me to take my blood money and leave. Others might accept it because they need help more than they need moral purity. The town would split, and the division would destroy the community I was trying to save. Sophia stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the neighborhood where her children played, where families struggled with dignity despite their circumstances. Frank, what if the choice wasn't yours to make? Both Frank and Elena looked at her, confused. What if the community knew the truth and chose for themselves whether to accept your help? Frank's face went pale. Sophia, you can't mean. I mean exactly that. Sophia turned to face them, her expression resolute. You've been making decisions for all of us based on what you think we can handle. But we're not children, Frank. We're adults who've lived through factory closures, job losses, medical bankruptcies. We understand that life is complicated. Elena felt her journalistic instincts engaging. Sophia's right. This story needs to be told, but it needs to be told completely. Not just the scandal, but the redemption effort. Not just the guilt, but the genuine attempt to make amends. Frank shook his head. You don't understand. Once this becomes public, everything changes. The media attention, the corporate scrutiny, the way people look at every family I've helped. Maybe, Sophia interrupted, or maybe this community is stronger than you think. Maybe we can handle the truth about where help comes from and still be grateful for the help itself. Elena pulled out her phone. Frank, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If I write this story, the whole story, your identity, your guilt, your charitable work, everything, will you cooperate? Will you help me tell it accurately? Frank was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. If this becomes public, Miguel will learn that his Marine hero's family is responsible for dead soldiers. Izzy will discover that her roof was paid for with blood money. Every family I've helped will have to decide whether they can live with accepting assistance from a Morrison. Yes, Sophia said simply, they will. And then they'll make their own choices about what that means. Elena set her phone on the table. Frank, your daughter gave you a week to decide about returning to corporate life. But the real decision isn't whether to go back to Morrison Defense. It's whether to trust this community with the truth about who you are. Frank looked out the window at Millbrook's struggling streets, at the abandoned buildings and the families trying to build lives amid economic collapse. Somewhere out there, Miguel Roberts was probably telling his friends about the cool Marine veteran who'd shared war stories. Somewhere else, Tommy Rodriguez was finishing another anonymous contract, not knowing he was distributing the profits from military contracts that had failed. If I do this, Frank said finally, there's no going back. The secret that's protected. And me for 7 years disappears forever. Secrets have a way of destroying the people who keep them, Sophia said gently. Maybe it's time to find out what truth can do instead. Frank nodded slowly, the decision settling over him with the finality of a terminal diagnosis. All right, but we do this right. Community meeting. Full disclosure. Let people ask questions, express their anger, make their own choices about whether they want anything to do with Morrison money. Elena felt the gravity of the moment. When? Frank looked at his prescription bottles, at the evidence of his declining health, at the 2 women who'd become unwitting guardians of his secret. Tomorrow night, at the food bank. If I'm going to destroy everything I've built here at least, I'll do it in the place where I tried to do some good. As Sophia and Elena prepared to leave, Frank called out softly, Sophia, after tomorrow night, when people know the truth, will you be able to let your children keep the roof I bought them? Sophia paused at the door, her hand on the knob. Frank, my children are sleeping safely for the first time in months because of what you did. Whatever else you are, whatever your family's company did, you're also the man who made sure my babies don't get rained on at night. That has to count for something. After they left, Frank sat alone in his modest duplex, surrounded by the careful simplicity he built to contain his guilt. Tomorrow night, he would strip away every defense and stand before his community as Franklin Morrison III billionaire, war profiteer, and the man who'd been trying to buy redemption with blood money. For the first time in 7 years, Frank Morrison didn't know if he was making the right choice. But it was the only choice that might allow him to die with something approaching peace. The Millbrook Community Center hadn't seen a crowd this large since the steel mill closure announcement 5 years ago. By 7 o'clock on Saturday evening, every folding chair was occupied, with additional residents standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Elena had worked all day to spread word of Frank Morrison's important announcement, though she'd carefully avoided revealing the true scope of what was about to unfold. Frank sat in the front row between Pastor Williams and Dr. Chun, his hands folded in his lap with the stillness of a man who'd accepted his fate. He wore his best shirt, a simple white button-down that had seen better decades, and his Marine Corps pin on the collar. Whatever happened tonight, he wanted to face it as both the man he'd been and the man he'd tried to become. Sophia Roberts entered with Miguel and Izzy, taking seats in the 3rd row where they could see Frank clearly. Miguel waved, still ignorant of the revelation that would shatter his hero worship within the hour. Izzy bounced in her seat, excited by the unusual evening gathering. Tommy Rodriguez sat with his wife Maria, their faces carrying the strain of people who'd spent the day wrestling with uncomfortable questions about the money that had saved their business. Elena had briefed them on what was coming, giving them time to process the implications before the public revelation. Mayor Patricia Hendricks called the meeting to order, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd presided over 5 years of civic decline. Folks, Mr. Morrison asked to address the community tonight. I understand he has something important to share. Frank rose slowly, the cancer making every movement deliberate. The room fell silent, except for the whisper of the heating system and the distant sound of traffic on Route 22. He walked to the front of the room, turned to face the assembled community, and felt the weight of 7 years of deception settle on his shoulders. "My name is Franklin J. Morrison III, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "I'm the owner of Morrison Defense Industries, and I'm probably worth about $4 billion. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by someone's sharp intake of breath and the creak of folding chairs as people shifted uncomfortably. Frank could see confusion rippling through the crowd. This humble food bank volunteer claiming to be one of America's wealthiest men. 7 years ago, my grandson Marcus Morrison was killed in Afghanistan when his body armor failed during an I'd attack. Marcus was a Marine, 22 years old, idealistic enough to enlist despite his family's wealth." Frank's voice remained steady, though Elena could see his hands trembling. "The armor that failed him was manufactured by my family's company, using specifications that prioritized cost savings over protection." Miguel Roberts leaned forward in his seat, his young face struggling to process what he was hearing. Sophia placed a protective hand on his shoulder. 67 Marines died wearing Morrison defense armor that didn't meet its stated specifications. The company paid $800 million in settlements and criminal fines. I signed off on the cost-cutting measures that led to those deaths. Frank paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. "My grandson died because I put profit margins ahead of the lives of the men I'd trained to serve their country." The room erupted. Angry voices rose from families who'd lost sons in Afghanistan and Iraq. Mrs. Patterson, whose son had served 3 tours, stood up shouting, "You killed our boys and then came here to play saint?" "Order," Mayor Hendricks called, but the damage was done. The revelation had cracked the room's composure like ice under pressure. Frank waited for the noise to subside, accepting the anger as his due. "Mrs. Patterson, you're right. I did kill your boys, and I did come here to play saint. The question is whether that matters to you." Dr. Chun stood, her medical authority commanding attention. "Frank Morrison has terminal cancer. He has perhaps 4 months to live. The money he spent helping families in this community, over $3 million in the past year, comes from Morrison defense dividends." "Blood money," someone called from the back. "Yes," Frank agreed simply. "Blood money. Profit from contracts that failed the people they were meant to protect. I couldn't live with it anymore, but I also couldn't bear to let it sit unused while people suffered." Elena rose, her journalist's training helping her navigate the emotional chaos. "For those who don't know me, I'm Elena Santos from the Tribune. I've been investigating Mr. Morrison's charitable activities for weeks. The Roberts family roof, the Henderson medical bills, Tommy Rodriguez's construction contracts, all paid for with Morrison defense money." Sophia Roberts stood, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. "My children are sleeping safely because of that roof. I don't care where the money came from." "You should care," replied Jim Henderson, whose son had been wounded by an IED in Iraq. "That roof was paid for with the blood of better men than him." Miguel Roberts suddenly spoke up, his 12-year-old voice carrying clearly through the room. "Mr. Morrison, did you know the armor was bad when you sold it?" The directness of the question silenced the adult arguing. Frank looked at the boy whose admiration he was about to lose forever. "No, Miguel. I trusted other people to ensure quality while I focused on profit margins. I was responsible for the failure, but I didn't know it was happening." "But you found out after?" "Yes. And that's when you left your company?" "Yes." Miguel was quiet for a moment, his young mind working through moral complexities that had stumped theologians. "So you made a mistake that killed soldiers, and now you're trying to help people with the money from that mistake." "That's right. Is that good or bad?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Pastor Williams stood, his chaplain's training, helping him recognize a community struggling with fundamental questions of justice and redemption. "Miguel's asked the right question," Pastor Williams said. Frank Morrison made decisions that contributed to military deaths. He's now using the profit from those decisions to help struggling families. The question isn't whether he's a good or bad person. The question is whether we're willing to accept help from someone whose wealth comes from tragedy. Tommy Rodriguez stood, his weathered face showing the strain of the past week's revelations. Folks, I've been taking Frank's money for months without knowing its source. My business is alive because of Morrison defense contracts. If we decide this money is too tainted to accept, I'll have to lay off my crew and probably lose the shop. Maria Rodriguez joined her husband. Our mortgage is current for the first time in 2 years because of the work Frank brought us. Are we supposed to give that up to make a moral statement? The debate that followed was painful and necessary. Families who'd lost sons in Iraq and Afghanistan argued passionately that accepting Morrison money dishonored their sacrifice. Others, desperate for the economic assistance Frank provided, countered that rejecting help wouldn't bring the dead back to life. Through it all, Frank stood silently, accepting both praise and condemnation with equal grace. Alina watched him carefully, noting how he seemed smaller somehow, as if the revelation had physically diminished him. Finally, Mayor Hendricks called for order. Folks, we need to make a decision. Mr. Morrison has offered to continue his charitable work with full disclosure of its funding source. The question is whether we accept that help or ask him to leave. I want to say something, Izzy Roberts announced, her 8-year-old voice cutting through the adult complexity with startling clarity. Mr. Morrison fixed our roof so I don't have to sleep in Mama's room when it rains. I like my own room. I don't care if he's rich or if his money is bad. He was nice to us. The simple honesty of a child's perspective seemed to deflate some of the room's anger. Pastor Williams seized the moment. Perhaps we should vote, he suggested. All in favor of accepting Mr. Morrison's continued assistance with full knowledge of its source, raise your hands. The vote was closer than Elena had expected, 37 in favor, 28 opposed, with several abstentions. A divided community, but a decision nonetheless. Frank nodded, accepting the community's judgment. For those who voted against, I understand. For those who voted in favor, I promise complete transparency about every dollar spent. And for everyone, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the decisions that led to Marcus's death and the deaths of other young Marines. I'm sorry for deceiving you about my identity. I'm sorry that my attempt at redemption has divided your community. As the meeting broke up, families clustered in heated discussions about the evening's revelations. Some left immediately, their disapproval clear. Others approached Frank, shaking hands or offering awkward words of support. Miguel Roberts walked up to Frank as his family prepared to leave. Mr. Morrison, Mr. Franklin, are you still a Marine? Frank knelt to the boy's level, his old knees protesting. Once a Marine, always a Marine, son. That doesn't change. Then you're still my friend. Marines take care of each other, right? Frank felt tears he'd been holding back all evening finally begin to fall. That's right, Miguel. Marines take care of each other. Outside the community center, Alina found herself standing next to Sophia Roberts in the parking lot. Around them, families dispersed into the night, carrying the weight of difficult decisions and moral complexity. How do you think this changes things? Elena asked. Sophia watched her children climb into their car, noting how Miguel seemed older somehow, aged by his encounter with adult moral ambiguity. I think we'll find out who we really are as a community. Whether we're the kind of people who can accept help from complicated sources, or whether our pride matters more than our children's welfare. And Frank? Sophia looked back at the community center, where Frank was still talking quietly with Pastor Williams and Dr. Chun. I think Frank Morrison just learned that redemption is messier than he expected. But maybe that's the only kind that actually means anything. As Millbrook's residents drove home through streets lit by failing streetlights, Each family carried their own version of the evening's events. Some went to bed angry, others relieved, still others confused about the moral implications of accepting help from wealth built on tragedy. Frank Morrison returned to his modest duplex, no longer anonymous, no longer protected by carefully constructed simplicity. He was dying, wealthy, and now publicly accountable for both his family's failures and his own attempts at redemption. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and the test of whether a community could heal from revelation or be destroyed by it. The week following Frank's revelation brought changes to Millbrook that no one had anticipated. The story broke nationally when Elena's carefully crafted article about the Billionaire hermit's guilt-driven charity was picked up by major news outlets. By Wednesday, television crews were setting up in the abandoned steel mill parking lot, their satellite trucks a stark contrast to the town's economic decay. Frank had braced himself for some media attention, but he hadn't expected the onslaught that followed. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and probing residents for comments about their so-called blood money benefactor. Lawyers from Morrison Defense Industries descended on the town, pushing for meetings about damage control and brand protection. Wealthy curiosity seekers drove in just to gawk, treating Millbrook's poverty like an exhibit. By Thursday morning, the pressure had taken a visible toll. Frank sat slumped in Dr. Chun's office, clearly deteriorating. The cancer was advancing faster than either of them had anticipated, and the emotional strain was only speeding up the process. "This media circus is killing you," Dr. Chun said, checking his vitals. "Your blood pressure's dangerously high, and you can't keep enduring this level of pain." Frank gave a small nod. "How long do I have? At this rate?" 6 to 8 weeks tops, she said gently. "The stress is making everything worse." She sat across from him, her tone shifting from clinical to compassionate. "You've come clean, Frank. Everyone knows the truth now. Maybe it's time to let someone else carry this load. Step back from the foundation." "I can't. Not yet," Frank replied, his voice noticeably weaker. "Victoria's threatening to challenge every donation as unauthorized. If I'm declared mentally unfit, they could undo everything. Sophia loses her roof. Tommy's contracts get voided. The Hendersons' medical bills come back. Then make it official," Dr. Chun urged. "Legalize everything before it's too late." Frank pulled a thick folder from his bag, already in motion. "Pastor Williams and I are launching the Morrison Redemption Foundation with a board made up of Millbrook locals. Every donation tracked, every expense approved by the community." Dr. Chun skimmed through the documents and nodded, impressed by the level of legal protection built into the structure. "Once this is filed, Victoria won't have a leg to stand on." "If I make it that far," Frank muttered, hands trembling. "Slightly. The lawyers need 2 more weeks. I just need to hold on." Outside Frank's private struggles, the town was unraveling. The Roberts family had become an unwilling symbol, bombarded by media. Reporters questioned Miguel and Izzy about living in a house paid for with so-called blood money. Sophia stopped answering calls and kept the children indoors every time a news van appeared. Tommy Rodriguez faced his own fallout. 3 employees quit after learning their paychecks came from Morrison defense-linked contracts. Others worried the connection would damage their reputations. Maria spent her days deflecting interview requests from journalists, curious about what it was like to profit off guilt. "This can't go on," Tommy told Frank at the food bank. "We're being pulled apart. Half the town treats us like heroes, the other half like we're tainted." Frank nodded, understanding too well the burden he had carried alone for years now weighed on everyone. "I can pull the contracts," Frank offered. "Transfer them to other companies if it'll protect you." "And then what?" Tommy snapped. "Back to scraping by?" "Frank, I appreciate what you tried to do, but now everything's complicated. Some days I wish you'd never told us the truth." Meanwhile, Pastor Williams found himself mediating community conflict. Families with military ties struggled with accepting help from a company linked to their loved ones' deaths. Others, in economic crisis, agonized over the morality of accepting the money at all. The church had become an unofficial counseling center. One evening, Pastor Williams brought up Frank's grandson. Marcus didn't have to enlist. He could have lived off the Morrison name, but he joined because he believed in something bigger. Frank, foggy from medication, managed a small smile. He wanted to earn his honor, not inherit it. Exactly. And so have you, Pastor Williams said. You've spent the last 7 years trying to redeem yourself through service, not wealth. Frank looked away, but it was built on a lie. I helped people, but I hid who I was and where the money came from. You spared them the moral burden you're asking them to carry now, the pastor replied. That wasn't deceit, it was protection. Elena, the local reporter who had broken the story, was overwhelmed. What began as an expose had spiraled into national coverage. Once accustomed to school board meetings and football games, she now fielded interview requests from major outlets. The spotlight was both exciting and exhausting, but as she watched the chaos unfold, doubts crept in. Her story had revealed the truth, but had it helped or hurt? At the grocery store, Sophia confronted her. Do you regret writing it? Elena thought for a moment. I regret the media frenzy. I regret that your family didn't get time or space to absorb it all. But I don't regret uncovering the truth. This town had a right to know. Even if that truth tears us apart, especially then. I'd rather see people face the truth, even painfully, than be united by a lie. Sophia didn't fully agree, but she understood. Some truths demanded to be known, no matter the cost. As they parted ways in the parking lot, Sophia realized that everyone involved, Frank, Elena, the community members struggling with moral decisions, was paying a price for transparency. The crisis came on Friday evening when Victoria Morrison Ashworth returned to Millbrook with a team of corporate attorneys and a court order demanding psychiatric evaluation of her father. She'd watched the media coverage with growing alarm, seeing the family name associated with guilt-driven charity and public confession of corporate failure. Frank was at home when the legal papers were served, too weak to answer the door himself. Pastor Williams had been visiting, helping Frank review the foundation documents that still needed 2 more weeks of legal preparation. This is a temporary restraining order preventing you from making any further charitable expenditures pending competency evaluation, the attorney explained. Mrs. Morrison Ashworth has petitioned the court for emergency guardianship based on evidence of impaired judgment and self-destructive behavior. Frank read the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades reviewing contracts. She's claiming I'm mentally incompetent because I've been giving away family money. The petition cites your withdrawal from corporate responsibilities, your deceptive charitable activities, and your recent public confession as evidence of diminished capacity, the attorney continued. The court has scheduled a hearing for next Wednesday. Pastor Williams felt his stomach sink. Wednesday was only 5 days away, not enough time to finalize the foundation documents that would protect Frank's charitable work. After the attorneys left, Frank sat in his kitchen with Pastor Williams. The weight of legal pressure added to his physical decline. She's going to win, Frank said simply. I'm dying. I've been living under an assumed identity, and I've been distributing family assets without corporate approval. Any judge will rule in her favor. We could ask for a delay, cite your medical condition. David, I don't have time for delays. The cancer is winning faster than the lawyers can work. Frank looked out his window at Millbrook's darkening streets. If Victoria gets control, she'll avoid every charitable expenditure. Sophia will lose her roof. Tommy will lose his contracts. And this whole community will learn that accepting help from a Morrison was a mistake. Pastor Williams studied his friend's face, seeing the exhaustion of a man who'd fought too many Battles, what do you want to do? Frank was quiet for a long time, listening to the sound of his own labored breathing. When he spoke, his voice carried the finality of a man making his last important decision. I want to call Elena Santos. If I'm going to lose this fight, I want to make sure the story of why I fought gets told correctly. Outside, Millbrook settled into another night of uncertainty, unaware that their struggling community had become the battleground for a family's reckoning with wealth, guilt, and the true cost of redemption. Frank Morrison had 6 days to prove that a dying man could still find honor in service, or watch everything he'd tried to build collapse under the weight of his daughter's legal challenge and his own failing health. Frank Morrison died on a Tuesday morning in December, 6 weeks before Victoria's legal challenge would have been heard in court. He passed peacefully in his modest duplex bedroom, with Pastor Williams reading scripture softly and Dr. Chun monitoring his final moments. His last words, whispered to Pastor Williams, were, "Tell Miguel the roof will always be his." The funeral 3 days later became something unexpected, a celebration of complicated redemption in a community still learning how to grieve for someone who'd been both savior and symbol of institutional failure. The service was held at Millbrook Community Church, its modest sanctuary packed beyond capacity with residents who'd spent weeks wrestling with the moral implications of accepting help from Morrison defense money. Elena Santos sat in the front row with Sophia, Miguel, and Izzy Roberts, watching as a community tried to make sense of a man who defied easy categorization. Miguel wore his best shirt and tie, his 12-year-old face carrying the gravity of someone who'd learned that heroes could be complicated. Izzy held a drawing she'd made of Frank fixing their roof, her 8-year-old understanding of the situation simpler, but perhaps more profound than the adults around her. Tommy Rodriguez served as a pallbearer alongside 5 other men whose lives Frank had quietly improved through anonymous contracts and charitable interventions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The town's working men carrying to rest a billionaire who'd spent his final years trying to earn the honor they'd given him freely. Pastor Williams delivered the eulogy with the careful precision of someone who'd become the keeper of Frank's most painful secrets. He spoke about Marcus Morrison, the young Marine whose death had shattered his grandfather's faith in the family business. He talked about redemption as a process rather than a destination, about service as the highest form of honor, and about the courage required to face one's own failures honestly. Frank Morrison was not a perfect man, Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary. He made decisions that contributed to military deaths, including the death of his own grandson. But he spent his remaining years trying to transform guilt into grace, wealth into service, and isolation into community connection. Whether he succeeded is not for us to judge, it's for us to carry forward. The most powerful moment came when Miguel Roberts asked permission to speak. Standing at the pulpit, barely tall enough to reach the microphone, he addressed the assembled community with startling maturity. "Mr. Frank taught me that being a Marine means taking care of people, even when it's hard. He was sad about soldiers who died because of bad armor his family made, but he didn't just stay sad. He fixed our roof and helped other families too. I think that's what Marines do. They fix things when they're broken, even if they're the ones who broke them." The congregation was silent as Miguel returned to his seat, his simple wisdom cutting through weeks of adult moral complexity with the clarity only children possessed. After the service, the community gathered at the food bank for a reception that Frank had planned in detail during his final weeks. He'd wanted it held there, among the canned goods and volunteer schedules. That had given structure to his anonymous years of service. Elena noticed that even families who'd opposed accepting Frank's charity attended, united by the strange bond of having shared in his complicated redemption. Victoria Morrison Ashworth attended the funeral but left immediately afterward, her corporate efficiency able to process a gathering that celebrated her father's rejection of the wealth and status she'd devoted her life to maintaining. Her absence spoke volumes about the unbridgeable gap between Frank's chosen family in Millbrook and the biological family he'd left behind. Dr. Chun approached Elena during the reception, carrying a manila envelope that Frank had entrusted to her care. "He wanted you to have this," she said quietly. The final story, as he saw it. Inside, Elena found a handwritten letter in Frank's careful script, along with legal documents establishing the Morrison Redemption Foundation exactly as he'd envisioned it. The foundation was community-controlled, with a board of Millbrook residents empowered to distribute funds transparently and ethically. More importantly, it was legally protected from corporate interference, Frank's final legal maneuver, completed just days before his death. The letter was personal, addressed to Elena as both journalist and keeper of his story. "Elena, you asked whether good deeds could atone for institutional failures. I've spent 7 years trying to answer that question, and I'm no closer to certainty now than when I started. What I do know is that Marcus would be ashamed of me for wallowing in guilt while people suffered, and proud of me for trying to serve others despite my failures. The money exists whether I use it or hide from it. At least this way, it serves families like the Roberts instead of sitting in banks earning interest on tragedy. The community will decide whether my redemption was genuine. I hope they'll judge the work rather than the worker. Tell Miguel that Marines never stop serving, even when they're not perfect. Tell the community that their acceptance of a flawed man's attempt at honor was the greatest gift they could have given a dying fool." In the weeks following Frank's funeral, Millbrook began the complex process of moving forward with the knowledge of who their benefactor had been and what his charity had cost. The Morrison Redemption Foundation began operations under community oversight, providing transparent assistance to families while acknowledging the complicated source of its funding. Some residents never reconciled themselves to accepting blood money, though most came to understand that Frank's personal guilt shouldn't prevent the community from using his wealth constructively. The foundation developed policies requiring full disclosure of funding sources and community approval for major expenditures, ensuring that Frank's legacy would be one of transparency rather than deception. Tommy Rodriguez's construction business stabilized under the foundation's contracts, though he instituted a policy of donating 10% of Morrison-funded project profits to military family charities. It was his way of acknowledging both the help he'd received and the source of that assistance. Elena Santos wrote Frank's full story for national publication, a complex examination of guilt, redemption, and community responsibility that won several journalism awards. But she always considered Miguel Roberts' eulogy the truest assessment of Frank Morrison's character, a man who'd tried to fix things he'd helped break, even when the fixing was imperfect. Miguel Roberts did indeed join the Marines after high school, inspired by Frank's example of service despite failure. He carried with him a letter Frank had written before his death, to be opened on the day of Miguel's enlistment. The letter spoke about honor as something earned through service rather than inherited through wealth, about the courage required to serve imperfectly, and about the responsibility of each generation to do better than the weight of service. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.